we're gonna look at the tone shift between, in just 2 weeks' time, from scandal to president. So let's take a look. Hello and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I am Jess Connell and I would love to earn your subscription. Today, we're going to be looking at Life magazines and the shift that happened in November 1963 about one man, Lyndon Johnson. Just 2 weeks before JFK was assassinated, this was the headline: the Bobby Baker bombshell. Capitol buzzes over stories of misconduct in high places. You can see the date, November 8th, 1963. Now, when you get to this article, what you find is a headline here that says, "That high-living Baker boy scandalizes the Capitol. From the Senate up and down a dark trail of misconduct." So, interestingly, right across from it here is the man who just 2 weeks from publication would be the President of the United States. But at this point, he was the Vice President to JFK. And JFK had been speaking to many, many advisors. In fact, his secretary even knew that he was likely to replace Lyndon Johnson on the ticket, and that he was looking to do that before the 1964 re-election campaign began. And so here we have the man that some people say could be somehow either responsible or at least have given some sort of assent to the plan to kill the president. Now, even if you don't believe that, the things that we are going to look at today are just fascinating from a historical point of view, from a journalistic point of view. What we're going to do, I have already read this article about the Bobby Baker scandal with you. Interestingly, it actually continues, their investigation continues into this Life magazine, which was published the day of the Kennedy assassination. And this one packs a punch. But this one put Lyndon Johnson, as you see, immediately tied to the scandal. So what we're going to do in this episode is not read the whole article, but I do want to look at the tone shift about LBJ from these weeks, which are in the 2 weeks prior to the assassination, to the very next week when, now this is the memorial edition without the cover. That happens to be how I purchased it. Eventually I'll probably get a full copy, but this is the one that I have. And it, of course, is introducing the people on November 29th, 1963, to the background of their new president. So we're going to look at the tone shift between, in just 2 weeks' time, from scandal to president. So let's just read the first paragraph, because the very first paragraph of this thing ties Lyndon Johnson to Bobby Baker, just like this photo does. I mean, interestingly, I don't believe I've ever seen a Life magazine photo where they put the logo up here. So I don't know if they were thinking about using this for the cover. I'm not sure. Those of you who are into these historical things, if you know, I would love to know. But this is the cover they ended up choosing for the Bobby Baker bombshell. But it does make me wonder if they considered using this one. I don't know. Here's the first paragraph. It says, "The dread cry of scandal, bane of all establishments, burst like a bombshell across the Washington autumn. It associated the name of Bobby Baker, the plausible young man on the opposite page, with an incredible mingling of high office, high influence, and high living. This Baker, a one-time Senate page, had served long and diligently as secretary to the Senate majority under the former majority leader, Lyndon Johnson, marshaling votes, handling campaign funds. He was known as Lyndon's boy." Then they immediately got into the Senate investigation. The article talks about the German call girl and Baker's blonde secretary and all different girls who were used, they call them girls, they were young ladies, to mingle. It shows us a history of this man, Bobby Baker, growing up in a tiny little town of Pickens, South Carolina. He came up as a Senate page at age 14, and everybody just thought he was the star of Pickens, that he was, the local boy makes good. He had done this amazing job and had immediately made connections with powerful people. Well, over time, he goes ahead and goes back, and he starts to ingratiate himself and integrate himself into the Washington machine. And very, very soon, he is someone who is wheeling and dealing in the Capitol and accumulating power very quickly. What he had done, however, was basically stake all of his interest on Lyndon Johnson. Within 2 years after accepting the offer to go ahead and become the Senate page, so we're talking about from 14 to now 16, 17 years old maybe, he was with the Senate clerical staff when he came upon Lyndon Johnson, and they made their connections. He also simultaneously was building up private business interests, and he would commingle those deals of political deals with financial arrangements. And so he comes in and he begins just accumulating property, and he, interestingly, owns this motel situation, I believe in Maryland, that has the same name as Jack Ruby's Club, which people have pointed out, I don't believe there's any real connection there. It is just an ironic part of this situation that two of the establishments that we hear about in relation to the JFK assassination or having something to do with JFK and scandal are called Carousel. I don't know if that was a common name or if it just was a coincidence. I'm not sure. But we have Bobby Baker wheeling and dealing with political people, with business interests, and that's how he gets more and more in the know and more able to wheel and deal, is that he has money to throw around. He can, all of a sudden set somebody up with an ongoing annuity or an ongoing investment, and they know not to cross him, and he also can make deals that way. Well, this is the entirety of the article. It ends by saying that Bobby had moved a short walk from the Lyndon Johnsons. That was about 2 weeks before he resigned his Senate job under fire. So he had built up his wealth enough that he could move near the Lyndon Johnsons, which is impressive. In the Washington, D.C. suburbs, those would not be inexpensive homes. They would not be small homes. So he has, come out of nowhere seemingly, and is literally at the highest levels of power. I think the thing that stands out the most about this is the way that there is just an unabashed connecting from the very beginning of this article of LBJ with scandal. I mean, the headline is bombshell, Capitol buzzes, misconduct. And then you get here and it says, high living Baker boy scandalizes the Capitol. And here we have Lyndon, and then the first line is the dread cry of scandal, and connects him with Lyndon. And so, that is an interesting tone for Life to have taken. Some have speculated that RFK was the one that fed these articles to Life magazine and was feeding this information because as Attorney General, he had powers of investigation. But I haven't seen proof that that's the case. I've just heard that people believe that he was a part of that. So that's that. Now we are going to look at this Life magazine and how it talks about Lyndon in the follow-up to that article. And I'll just remind you, this is the one that was published the day of JFK's assassination. And so these things were in the works in real time the day of the assassination. In fact, I would love to hear more about this. If you happen to know an article or know about this, I have heard that there was a closed door congressional committee investigating the day of the assassination, and that in real time they're getting news. And once the news comes through that the president has passed, that the man who was testifying literally folds up all of his documents, puts them into his briefcase and says, we're done here, that it is a very different thing to testify about a vice president than a president. and that it all comes to a conclusion. But that's just hearsay for me. I have not actually seen documents of that. So if you know anything about that or know a book that talks about that or an article, I would love to know. Okay, so this one is also, it's just called the Bobby Baker Scandal. Now we'll notice it was not on the cover. They had already done the cover 2 weeks prior. And so this one is just titled The Bobby Baker Scandal. It says it grows and grows as Washington shudders. And it's interesting because it says it's by Keith Wheeler, but then it also credits and a life task force. So there was apparently a whole group of investigators. And what you find is that, wow, you remember the last article that was heavy on the photos, and we're talking about two spreads, two pages, two full page is how long that article was. But look at this wall of text. So this is where the investigation happens. It says, scandal grows and grows in Washington. The Bobby Baker case, U.S. Senate writhes as nation focuses on a mess involving one of its own. And it specifically says this story is the work of a 9-member task force, and it lists them all. So I don't recognize any of these names, but it says their coverage reached from Washington, west to Honolulu, and east to Bonn. Okay, the article actually focuses in on Bobby Baker, but I'm going to go ahead and read you a few snippets throughout this article that focus on Lyndon Johnson. So the article starts like this. Last week, an old friend of Bobby Jean Baker, brooding over the scandal jitters that have been jumping from ganglion to ganglion through Washington's political nervous system ever since Baker fell from grace as secretary to the Democratic majority of the U.S. Senate, delivered himself of an opinion. If Bobby ever told everything he knows, there wouldn't be any Senate left, Democrat or Republican. And then the article goes into the way that actually it is not an issue of Democrats. It is actually an issue of the Senate, that the Senate itself has been controlled by this man. And it says, for 3 weeks, a crew of Life reporters has been exploring this question. They ransacked Washington from cellar to garret, crisscrossed the map from Las Vegas to Dallas, Milwaukee to Miami. And then as it goes through talking about what they investigated, it says, in a very real sense, the present establishment is the personal creation of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who, from the day he took over as majority leader until he went to the vice presidency, ruled it like an absolute monarch. When he moved to the executive branch, the baton of power passed to the late Senator Robert Kerr, who until his death last New Year's Day held unofficial title as King of the Senate. Since Kerr's death, control has diffused into several hands, including Harry Byrd of Virginia, George Smathers of Florida, Richard Russell of Georgia, and Everett Dirksen of Illinois. Now, anybody who's been around Washington knows that Russell and Dirksen are names of buildings now that we have on the Capitol. But they are here talking about the power that had been diffused from Lyndon Johnson, from him to Robert Kerr, and then from him into the hands of 4 men. So they are deconsolidating power, but he had consolidated it, and Bobby Baker was his right-hand man. It says, Bobby Baker grew up in the Senate and eventually became a power in his own right by insinuating himself into the service in favor of the establishment's mighty men, first Johnson, then Kerr. Skip down a bit, it says it was Johnson who sponsored Bobby Baker's election as majority secretary and fashioned him into his leg man, mouthpiece, and satrap of power. Johnson couldn't have picked a better man. If anything, Bobby knew the Senate even better than Johnson did. Baker had reached the Senate in 1942 as a page of 14. He had come from Pickens, South Carolina, a country boy so awed and scared that before leaving Washington, he took a ride 10 miles from Easley to Greenville, just so I could say I'd been on a train before. But he didn't stay country, and he didn't stay scared. Bright, obliging, energetic, and inquisitive, he soaked up the Senate like a sponge. By the time he became Assistant Majority Secretary in 1951, he was more expert in the Senate's lore, intricacies of maneuver, and its personalities than most of the elected senators. Like a young Cebu, herding bewildered elephants, he was adept at settling freshman senators into their strange surroundings and thereby incurring debts of gratitude that were payable on future call. Later, as Baker grew in stature, he became adroit at shepherding stray solons tamely into the establishment's fold. "You get along if you go along," was his standard counsel, and senators listened. If young Baker was proud of his role in the Senate and loyal to it, he was even more passionately loyal to his heroes in it. He had a sure instinct for where the power lay and fastened himself first to Johnson in worshipful attachment. Now listen to this. I want to point out in the first article we just got that they were hand in hand. There's the arm around Bobby photo. But in this one, it says the present establishment is the personal creation of Lyndon Johnson. And now we're about to hear that Bobby Baker had Lyndon worship, and we're going to hear the nature of that. And so they are definitely tying Lyndon to this scandal. And they're saying, even though he's not still in the Senate, he is the one who created this man and his power, and implying, I think, and certainly knew what was going on. Let's continue reading. It says, he always spoke of LBJ as the leader. A man who knows Baker well said recently. He even tried to be Johnson. He copied Johnson's clothes and mannerisms. When he came into the Senate chamber, he'd take the Johnson stance, smooth his sideburns, brace his shoulders, and scowl up at the balcony. The whole bit. The only thing wrong with his act was that he was 6 inches too short. We'll skip down a little bit later to where Lyndon is mentioned again. It says, some people thought the purpose of a campaign committee was to elect as many Democrats as possible. But what Lyndon wanted was a nice, cozy little majority that he could handle with no backtalk, no mavericks. Bobby Baker was Lyndon's bluntest instrument in running the show the way he wanted it. He'd go around the country putting the arm on those oil men in the Southwest, and then he'd hand out the money where it would do the most good for them. It's frequently customary when campaign contributions are made for the donor to earmark part or all of the gift for a specific candidate. But under the operations of the Johnson-Baker axis, the earmarking did not always stay put. One Western candidate was bitter in 1958 when Baker offered him $3,000 in cash. He happened to know that the donor had handed in $25,000 and that $12,000 of it was earmarked for him. "You're doing all right. You don't need it," Baker bluntly told him when he protested. So they are handling political power. They are handling election power. They are handling business interests, and all of it is being used in service of Lyndon's goal. Now, one thing I just noticed that I think is really interesting, I don't remember if I picked up on this the first time I read the article, but Lyndon talking about wanting a small majority, meaning, you need 51 votes in the Senate. But what he's saying he wanted was 51 to 54 votes, a small majority. You don't want 60, 65, because that encourages people to then develop their own opinions and vote the way they like, because the party can get along without me and I can do what's actually according to my conscience. But when you need every vote to pass a bill, then suddenly you need a tight majority, and you can keep everybody in line by saying, don't you let the Democrats lose this bill. We've got to get it passed, and you've got to go along to get along. You've got to be a part of the party, and you've got to vote the party line. So that's interesting that they could use that small majority mindset to actually control power a little better, rather than having some who could be loosey-goosey and be mavericks. So that's interesting. It says Baker was not only a charter member of the Coup, which was the Quorum Club, a charter with the intent to be literary purposes, mutual improvement, and the promotion of social intercourse. But he had other valuable contacts, like the president of an aerospace company, who called Bobby a great friend of mine for many years. And it says, not long ago, Baker moved his family into a $124,500 house within hallooing distance of millionaire Lyndon Johnson's own mansion. Now, interestingly, we have him being called a millionaire here. I did just notice also, I'll read part of the next paragraph. It talks about the pyramiding accumulation of this group, the Q Club, the Quorum Club. And it says, a Western Democratic senator is wryly amused at the news that the scandal and legal interests and business interests and political interests are all intertwined. He says, I'm not surprised that he was in business for himself. And it talks about other people who had close contacts within this quorum club. George Smathers was a senator. Glenn Troop was a lobbyist for the U.S. Savings and Loan League. It mentions Thomas D. Webb Jr. And then it notes that this man, Thomas D. Webb Jr., represents the Washington interests of Texas millionaire Clint Murchison Jr. Possibly through Webb, Baker also became friends with a non-resident Coup member, Bedford Wynn of Dallas, Murchison's partner in ownership of the Dallas Cowboys, a professional football team, and with Murchison himself. From time to time, Baker has been a prominent guest at Murchison Business Social Affairs, and it talks about those parties. Oddly enough, this man, Clint Murchison, the night before printing, on November 21, had hosted a party at his home that reportedly, according to Lyndon Johnson's mistress, Madeline Brown, had not only Murchison, but Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, the future president, Howard Hunt, Jack Ruby, and others. Lots of high-ranking Dallasites. Now, I will say she gave this interview when she was in her 70s or 80s, but she did identify that party pretty early on to certain people. But the interview that I saw was when she was older. But she said that Lyndon, Nixon, and Clint Murchison and Jack Ruby were all there at the same meeting the night before. And that at the end of that meeting was when he told her, I'm not going to have to worry about the Kennedys after tomorrow. So take that for what you will, but interesting that he's being mentioned here in this article, same day as the assassination. Of course, they didn't know that that meeting had just taken place. Now, the article skips on. I'm telling y'all, this is a long article. Now, this subheading for this one says, backdrop for big deals, dances in harem pants, nude baths in champagne. And again, we have a wall of text. I have gone through and highlighted the section that we are going to read. It says, the girls' neighbors recall that Carol and Mary Alice entertained frequently and appeared to be popular hostesses to a wide variety of guests. And then it says many other girls took part as well, and mentions a lot of the places that they would do these things. They would travel. Such girls appear mainly as companions or adjuncts of the art of lobbying. Thus, one way or another, they also appeared in Bobby Baker's political, social, and business orbits. Some knew him, some had been at parties where he was a guest, some were frequent guests at the Q Club. At the extreme of this social whirl were professional call girls. Their role acquires importance because they appeared not merely as toys, but as chattels employed to effect great decisions. It reminds me of the Epstein scandal, but we will keep going with this article. There are pages and pages of text. Here on one page, it talks about the vending concessions that he made, and it's talking about all the different business profits that he has made. It talks about Jimmy Hoffa and borrowing money, actually, from Jimmy Hoffa's Teamsters to promote his own motel deal. Now, when you are in business and you start wheeling and dealing and making any sort of connection at all with Jimmy Hoffa, you should question your choices. But that's what he's doing. We get towards the end of the article. It's talking about a friend of theirs and the making of this much publicized Carousel Motel in Ocean City, Maryland. That's a resort 140 miles from Washington. It says that almost before they knew it, the Novaks, these friends, found themselves tied up in a scary three-way partnership, which had $75,000 invested in real estate. But Baker's notions kept expanding. And sadly, this man friend of his took his own life. On the day of Novak's funeral, Mrs. Novak recalled recently, Baker came to her house with a law associate, Ernest Tucker, and carried away all the motel accounts. Then at Baker's suggestion, she accepted Tucker as her lawyer for the estate. So Baker and this man and his wife are in a business deal. The man takes his own life over the stress of it, reportedly over the stress of it. And immediately, Baker shows up in the home with his own lawyer, takes away the financial papers and books, and says you should use this man as your lawyer, the same man who's over the actual motel. He was also attorney for the Carousel, which finally opened on July 22nd, 1962, with Hollywood hoopla and Vice President Johnson as guest of honor. But somehow things never did go right for the Carousel. Bills kept piling up, and the place had 8 managers in 7 months. So it's clearly not actually turning a profit. They could be skimming off the top, or they could just be using it as the location for other goings on that do make them a profit. But the business itself is making no profit. But the point that I wanted to point out to you is not just that there's this scandal of, sadly, this friend of his being malused for business purposes, but also that Vice President Johnson was the man of honor at the opening of this Carousel motel that was then used for these tawdry purposes. The end of the article says this: "It may be useful to note the observation of one of Baker's longtime acquaintances. You take a hungry kid from the hills of South Carolina and expose him to this big political conduit streaming with dough. And hell, what would you expect? But Baker's weakness was, once he had had it made, just having it wasn't enough. It was compulsive. He wanted you to know that he had it. In the end, as Baker's cynical world views the scandal, that was Bobby's only mistake." And that is the article about the Bobby Baker scandal on the day that JFK was assassinated. So now, 1 week later, in this article, let's see how Johnson is spoken about. Remember, this would have been the very next week. And of course, the whole world has shifted. On the opening page, of course, it starts out with the editorial that talks about President Kennedy, his assassination, his accomplishments, the shock of the moment. Then, after the break in the article, it says, before the 1960 convention, John Kennedy called Lyndon Johnson his number 2 choice after himself for president. Johnson has some of Kennedy's qualities: self-confidence, energy, fondness for power, political professionalism. A political professional's first duty, said Johnson last January, is, quote, to appeal to the forces that unite us and to channel the forces that divide us into paths where a democratic solution is possible. It is our obligation to resolve issues, not to create them. Of civil rights, he has said, da-da-da-da-da. So it says he's going to take the nation forward, and they pray for his protection. So that is how he is first mentioned in this article. I will remind you, as I sometimes do, that this was all happening in the middle of the holidays. And so in the middle of these very impactful articles about the death of the president come Christmas advertisements. This one is about an organ, the Wurlitzer organ, that you can play this song 15 minutes after Santa delivers your new Wurlitzer organ. Honestly, playing it is that easy. So, and then a toaster oven. There's all sorts of gift ideas amidst these articles. So we come to the classic. It is so hard to breeze over these, but we are focused on Johnson. We come to the classic article that has the assassination of President Kennedy with the Zapruder images that were released. And what I have learned since this point from a man named Robert Groden, he is the author of that fabulous book, JFK Absolute Proof. I'll put a link in the comments as to how you can get that book. I've just gotten it, and you guys, it is fantastic. I was actually able to meet Mr. Groden and his wife. Here is the book. I have it wrapped in plastic because I have a large family and a busy home, and I just don't want anything to accidentally spill on it. So I'm keeping it wrapped at this and then pulling it out every time I want to read it, which is basically every day. And I'm a good halfway through the book. I'm just letting myself pour slowly over it. It is so good. Well, what I learned from Robert Groden that I hadn't previously known is the reason why these are in black and white. This was not recorded in black and white. The original recording was colorized, so color has not been added when you see color. These were done this way so that they could print it, because apparently at this time it would have been too difficult to take the negatives in such a manner, in such a fast way, and to get it into color in the magazine. And so the purpose, somebody asked him explicitly, was that to dull the emotional quality of these frames? And he said, no, it really was a function of what they could actually get printed, and that they could print black and white frames relatively easily. And so they did that. But even still, not every frame is here. Frames were pulled out. And so we have that whole article. Then we get to The Sadness by Theodore White is the author who wrote this article, and it's very good. We read through this before, and I will link to that in the show notes. You can look for it like this. Then we have the next article, which we have just read. It is Death Found Him from This Window, and it has the sniper's nest window view. And then the article about Lee Harvey Oswald and his meet with death, which also had happened since the last publication. That article, which we just read through in one of our more recent videos, talks about Marina and Marguerite and is very just insightful. I think the thing that stood out to me the most was how many details they got wrong. It is not clear to me whether that was purposeful or whether they were being fed wrong information. I am not a researcher to that level yet, but I am trying to read with a critical eye for things like that. So now we get to the look at Lyndon Johnson's life. It says, so it has the photo of the two of them there at the National Convention in 1960. And the article says, a tough and skillful legislator who knew 4 presidents well. He made his way up from a frame house in Texas. Here at the top, we have Lyndon with FDR. It says 1937 with FDR. Johnson greeted FDR in Galveston as president debarked from yacht. FDR had appointed Johnson to his first government post in National Youth Administration and helped the young Texan win his first campaign. I didn't realize that. Look how skinny and young he is in that picture. Lyndon Johnson's life. The new president has worked with 4 previous ones, and in those years that carried him from Texas to the White House, he grew from a bright and agile freshman congressman to one of the most skillful, subtle, and effective legislators in our history. So that's how they are introducing and talking about him just 2 weeks after the scandal article. Franklin Roosevelt found him first when Johnson in 1938 ran for Congress as a New Deal liberal and won out in a big field of Texas conservatives. Roosevelt was so pleased with his victory that he gave him a lift to Washington on the presidential train. Johnson was in the House for 12 years with time off to become its first member to go to World War II, and then in 1948 was elected senator. In 1953, he became minority leader in a Republican Senate. When the Democrats won the Senate, he took over the caught-in-the-middle job of majority leader under an opposition party president. By now, he had become a superbly canny manager and manipulator of votes in the hard bargaining cloakrooms of Congress, and he served with such diligence that President Eisenhower called him the best Democrat in the Senate. When Johnson became vice president in 1960, he ranged the world, bringing his open-handed approach to new nations, Senegal, Vietnam, Pakistan, which had become constituents to woo and win in a totally new kind of global politics. Like 2 of his predecessors, Eisenhower and Truman, Johnson was plain-born, in a frame house not far from the Texas ranch he owns today. Like Eisenhower, he suffered a heart attack and went on strong as ever. Like Kennedy, he served in the Navy in World War II and has kept a surpassing interest in the frontiers of the nation's defense. He matured into the tough and fiercely demanding world of politics to become the man who could say, by personal choice, I am a Democrat. But I am a free man, an American, and a Democrat, in that order. It shows photos of him with Eisenhower and Truman, and then it shows baby photos. It says, here's his father, Sam Ely Johnson Jr., who was a school teacher, farmer, and 5-term member of the Texas state legislature. That's him. It shows childhood photos and that he was a star on the Southwest Texas State Teachers College team. He was a Navy officer. We have that photo. It says commissioned lieutenant commander 3 days after Pearl Harbor. Johnson served for 7 months as a special presidential emissary before being recalled to Congress. So he served on behalf of the president. That's him there. Interesting. I didn't realize that he had done that. Here we have false victory. He ran for Senate in 1941, whooping it up when he thought he won. The recount showed that he lost. So he won in 1948. He hobnobs with Rayburn and Symington. Here he is in hearings with Saltonstall. Wow, these are old names that I am not familiar with. And then here he is with Richard Nixon. It's interesting, with the Senate, you do have the powerhouse, and yet it's constantly changing, so that who was in the Senate 100 years ago, unless they named a building or a major act or some sort of major piece of legislation after them, then you don't actually hear those names very often. Here they show him in his powerful position. He's there at the top with poet Robert Frost. He's here with John Glenn, but then circling the globe, meeting with various dignitaries and going around the world and keeping an eye on space, it says. Here it says the father of a queen. Johnson kisses Linda Bird, now 19, when she was crowned Azalea Queen. His other child, Lucy Baines, is 16. Thus, the initials of the whole family, including wife Lady Bird, are LBJ. So, Lyndon Baines, Lady Bird, which isn't her real name, but it's what she took on, Linda Bird, and Lucy Baines. And then that's the end of that article. I think it's interesting. I don't think we saw a photo of Lady Bird in any of those photos. Isn't that weird? But the article was definitely focused on, he is a powerful man. He is a statesman. He knows his way around. And then I just wanted to show y'all, they have a feature article on him in just 2 weeks, December 13th, that is him taking his role at the White House desk. So that is the Life magazine transformation that we see of Lyndon Johnson in a month's time, to go from being arm around the guy in scandal to talking about how he was the creator of that whole unethical machine, to he's a statesman that we can trust the country with, to here he is at the presidential desk. Quite a story arc. What do you think about it? Let me know in the comments. I look forward to reading your comments as always. And I enjoyed looking back through these multiple magazines just to refresh my own memory, because a lot of times I only get to touch those articles, like the Bobby Baker articles, one time when you and I go through them together, because I usually don't look at articles in advance. I try to reserve my genuine response to share with you all. So it was helpful to get to re-look at some of those things, and specifically with an eye toward Lyndon Johnson. So let me know what you noticed. Let me know what stands out to you. Any of the questions that I asked, if you have answers to them, leave them in the comments, please, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day.